the average time to exit for hard tech companies in this space is closer to 5 years, I think. So it's actually a lot quicker than I think a lot of people have assumed for a long time. People have assumptions that it's going to be 10, 12, 15 years. But looking at the data, it is more appropriate for and fits well within kind of a venture model. So I do wish that there was a little bit more of an understanding on the LP side about the opportunities that exist and what this landscape really does look like, not just in terms of the impact, but also when it comes to the potential for really exciting returns.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Woo!
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Jay Klaus, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Lover of the Hard Sciences himself, Eric Hornung.
Jay, we've had so many cool companies on that are just doing things that I have no idea how to even begin to understand.
Do you yet feel comfortable enough, if you were wearing your investor hat, to start throwing some money into hard science companies?
I think I feel more comfortable. I don't think I'm at a place where I understand how the business model evolves from, hey, we're non-dilutive and we are really focused on building out this product and this technology. And then how does that transition to the commercial? That transition is still where I have my most amount of questions. But I guess as an investor, that's probably what you're coming on for, is to help them think about this, getting it out of the academic setting and into the more commercial setting.
If I'm an investor, I love the fact that so many of these founders seem to be going a non-dilutive route to start, because you're not diluting me either. But I wonder if on the show here, if we've overrepresented founders who have gone through a non-dilutive route, or if that truly is either necessity or just more available to companies in the hard sciences.
My take is that when you're developing the technology and you're kind of doing things that aren't commercially specific, I think that there's a lot of grant money, there's a lot of academic money, there's a lot of resources that you can use in that pursuit if you want to. But Jay, we haven't really talked to any investors who are really investing in the hard sciences space. We're both big fans of Josh Wolf. He's kind of playing in this space. We haven't talked to him on the podcast. And we don't really see many investors who have this focus.
Well, today, my friend, that is going to change. We are speaking with Rose Maizne, a partner at Renewable Tech Ventures, which is based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Renewable Tech Ventures is an early-stage clean tech venture fund investing in early-stage innovations in energy, clean technology, green materials, and other clean tech. They were founded in 2010. Technically, they are a Canadian fund domiciled in Alberta, Canada, but based and operating out of Salt Lake City.
I wonder how common that structure is.
I don't know. I thought it was new and unique. In a former life when I was doing Tixers, the company that purchased us had investment from Canadian investors. It was a Canadian company based in Florida with an executive team living in the UK. And I thought that was the strangest thing that I've ever heard of. So maybe it's actually not all that uncommon. There might be some benefits to being domiciled in Canada that we don't know, whether it's for the type of companies that they invest in or whether it's for being a fund. I don't know. So maybe we should ask Rose that here on the pod. Rose is also a co-founder of Womenpreneurs, working with women in entrepreneurship in the Salt Lake area. I'm sure that will come up in the conversation as well.
And before we get into the interview, just want to give a shout out to Jessica Peltz for connecting us with Rose, as she has done with so many of our recent guests.
So if you have thoughts as we go through this interview, you can tweet at us as always at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm. And we'll get into that interview right after this. Eric, what do SaaS companies, autonomous vehicle companies, cybersecurity companies, blockchain companies, and consumer marketplaces all have in common?
They're all companies.
They're all companies, and they're all companies who have hired our friends at Integrity Power Search to help them fill their talent needs. Integrity Power Search is the #1 full-stack, high-growth startup recruiting firm between the coasts. They partner with venture capitalists, private equity groups, and CEOs to build amazing teams for the world's most disrupting companies that may be SaaS, autonomous vehicles, blockchain, consumer marketplaces, insurtech, robotic process automation. Eric, they can do it all.
They can do it all, and we've seen them do it all. They are impressive.
Over 600 searches since 2012, more than 200 happening just this year in 2019. Their clients have collectively raised over $2.5 billion in venture funding. If you want to hear how Integrity Power Search can help your team fill your talent needs, go to upside.fm/integrity and get started.
Integrity Power Search, who you gonna call? That's their slogan, right?
I don't think it is, but maybe it is now.
All right. You're welcome for that one, Caleb.
Rose, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
On Upside, we like to start with a background of the guests. Can you tell us the history of Rose?
Sure. I am your least likely venture capitalist. Well, maybe not least likely, but pretty high up there. I started my career firmly in the nonprofit sector as like a, wearing my heart on my sleeve, do-gooder. That's like, I think I started my first nonprofit in giant air quotes when I was about 7 or 8 years old. It was called Life Low Income Family Earnings. And I baked cookies and forced the people in my mother's office to buy them. And she worked at a organization called the Children's Center here in Salt Lake. And then they would be donated, or I would donate the profits from the cookies to the folks that she was working with. So I had always thought that I wanted to work in the nonprofit sector. And then I did, and very quickly burnt out. I was in the nonprofit sector in Utah starting in about 2009. And I mean, those were tough times all around, but especially for the nonprofit community. And it just seemed like there was a lot of competition. We were constantly chasing funds and not focusing as much on actually serving the communities we wanted to be serving. And it just seemed like there had to be another model out there where you could do good, but be more effective and have kind of more sustainable funding models. And I went to a presentation in 2011, I believe, or 12 on this crazy thing called impact investing. And, it was the proverbial light bulb moment. I knew that was what I wanted to be doing. I told my family that I was going to move into venture capital, and they thought I'd had a stroke. They couldn't believe that their, nonprofit daughter wanted to jump into the realm of venture capitalists. But I was fortunate to find a really phenomenal venture capital fund here in Salt Lake that had just gotten started up, Renewable Tech Ventures. And it seemed like, they were investing in clean tech solutions. It seemed like that must be what impact investing is. I sat down for the first time with the fund founder, Todd Stevens, and told him, like, that's so cool that you have an impact investment fund in Utah. And he was like, what is an impact investment fund? And it was at that time when impact was really nascent. And so I was really fortunate because I had no background in venture capital, no background in clean tech, but I kind of positioned myself as someone who could help them kind of develop the impact side of things, and basically spent about a year having lunch with the team and convincing them that they really should hire this completely underqualified nonprofit sector enthusiast, and that somehow I'd be a good fit for venture capital. So that's how I kind of made my way into this space. And I once we finally decided that it would be a good fit, we were going to do kind of like a trial for a couple months. I actually sat down for my first day at work and was like, what have I done? Promptly Googled venture capital, because I was like, actually, don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing now. And then spent the next several years basically learning alongside the best team possible. It's been a true apprenticeship. I've been doing it for 6.5 years now, learned from some of the best. I started out as an analyst, became an associate, and now I'm a partner in our second fund. So that is my story of becoming the least likely venture capitalist.
I know that in nonprofits, people wear a lot of hats, but what were your kind of roles when you were working in the nonprofit space?
Yeah, well, another thing that I had going for me is that I had mostly done fundraising. I mean, I feel like at one point or another, if you want to work in the nonprofit sector, you're forced into fundraising, whether you like it or not. So I was very comfortable asking people for money. And it turns out that when you make the jump into venture capital or working in the startup ecosystem, that is a skill that is very valuable. I have no problem trying to figure out, who a good target for your fundraising would be, and then talking to them about why they should give us their money or why they should give one of our portfolio companies their money. So that's what I've mostly been focusing on in the nonprofit sector. Although we, again, to your point, everyone wears many hats. So I've been an associate director, an interim executive director, doing all sorts of things from literally mopping floors to hosting and organizing events to developing programs.
Were you always comfortable asking people for money, or did that come through working in nonprofits for a while?
I kind of jumped right into the fundraising side of things. And I think I was just too young and naive to know that not everyone wants to ask people for money or be asked for money. So it was not anything that I felt like I had to really prepare myself for or seek additional training to be able to do.
How do you define impact investing?
It's interesting. I actually listened to your podcast with Vermont Works, the Vermont Works folks who I've had the chance to meet, and I think what they're doing is amazing. And I appreciated his description of impact. You can define impact in many ways, and some people think of it in terms of doing good first and foremost, and then while also doing well sometimes. Thinking of it more as like venture philanthropy or a different way to allocate money that would otherwise just be a donation and not expecting a strong financial return. For us at Renewable Tech, we call ourselves actually an IRR-driven impact fund. So we believe that it is possible to invest in really exciting opportunities that have the potential for tremendous environmental and often social impact, while also generating strong financial returns, that are competitive in venture capital more broadly.
When you were thinking about going from nonprofiteer to capitalist, and you said you were talking to Renewable Tech Ventures for about a year, were you looking at other companies as well, other firms? Was there more of this going on in Utah and more broadly?
Oh no, all my eggs were in that one small basket. That was in part because at the time there really wasn't much impact investing happening in Utah and Salt Lake specifically. And then I think it was just that team specifically seems so ideal to me, both because they were willing to give me the time of day and clearly willing to work with me and to make it a true apprenticeship. We talked early on about needing to get an MBA if I was really going to be serious about this. And they said that they would support me in that. And they stayed true to that promise. They not only helped me to get an MBA, but let me, pick the academic institution of my choice. I really wanted to go outside of Utah. I felt like I had a great Utah network. So they put up with me commuting to Berkeley for 19 months and being in the office maybe one day a week if they were lucky. So, I early on felt like this, if I was going to do the whole venture capital thing, I wanted it to be with this team and with this firm.
I'm interested to hear, coming on the back of your nonprofit experience, how you found yourself in a presentation on impact investing in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was, I think the Utah Society of Fundraisers was trying to mix things up a little bit and asked Darian Rodriguez Heyman, who was a guest lecturer at Berkeley at the time, to come and be the keynote speaker. It didn't make a ton of sense, but was a pivotal turning point for me. So I'm forever grateful that they had a really inappropriate keynote speaker at this fundraising conference. And he talked about impact investing and talked about everything that Berkeley was doing as a kind of thought leader in the space that was, it was so early at that time. I went home that night actually and was like, yep, this is what I want to do. Apparently Berkeley's doing it. I should probably go to Berkeley and sign up for their mailing list, years before that was ever even a possibility. There's no way I would have been accepted at the time. And I think I still might get emails from their full-time program. So, that was a pivotal moment, not just in helping me understand my interest in impact investing, but also really setting me on a path towards getting a degree from an institution that has done so much work in that space.
When I think about Salt Lake City, I don't think immediately clean tech, renewable tech. Why is Renewable Tech Ventures in Salt Lake?
Utah is not known for its really progressive environmental policies. It's in part because we have two fund founders, Todd Stevens. Todd is a Utah native, as am I. And he had started a venture fund, Wasatch Ventures in Utah, later became Epic Ventures, which is one of the more well-known firms here. And he had a background in renewable energy generation. He's kind of your classic accidental impact investor in that he started to think about, he was at a point where he'd raised a number of funds with Epic Ventures. They had some great success stories, but he really wanted to do something that he felt would leave a better legacy and put his money, to work in areas that was doing something good for the world. Again, he had no idea that impact investing was a thing. He was just someone who recognized that this was his value set, and he wanted to start investing along that value set. And so he left Epic and brought a few of the guys from Epic with him, and then teamed up with Dal Zemp, who was a serial entrepreneur at the time living in Alberta, Canada. And so it was mostly just a function of the fact that, where our team happened to be based. It was not because Utah at the time was a particularly exciting landscape for clean tech, although we have some of our investments in our first fund are Utah companies. And increasingly, I'm constantly impressed by the progress that we've made as a state in terms of improving the policies that are supportive of clean tech and also incubating some really exciting clean tech companies. It's not a clean tech hub by any means, but there's at least a lot of progress that has been made.
Where do you find most of your investments being made geographically, if only a few are in Utah?
So our first fund, we focused on the Rocky Mountain region, and part of our thesis, and I should back up a little bit just to say that we were first deploying capital in 2011 and 12, and this fundraising in 2011, and that was not a good time to be fundraising in general, especially for clean tech. I mean, if for folks who know kind of the history with clean tech in the venture capital community, the boom and subsequent bust was all happening in kind of 2008, and then the bottom fell out in about 2011, and so when Todd first had the idea for coming up with a clean tech fund, and what is arguably the worst time to be fundraising for a new clean tech fund, he really wanted to develop a model that he felt was a more kind of responsible way to invest in clean tech using venture as an asset class. And so one of the things that he looked at was the type of investments that were being made, and we can talk about this in a little bit, but essentially our investment thesis is that we use a clean tech investment lens and look across sectors and industries. That does not sound novel now, but at the time that was like, people are like, well, is that even clean tech? It's not, there are no batteries and biofuels and solar in your portfolio. How's that a clean tech fund? But I think he was a little bit ahead of the curve in recognizing that there are all these other really exciting opportunities out there that are arguably a better fit for the venture model in terms of capital requirements, time to an exit. One of the things that we look for in our fund is what we call a resilient revenue model, which means a company can't be dependent on tax incentives or subsidies or a specific regulatory environment, even a specific macroeconomic condition for success. And again, all of that was kind of overlooked in Clean Tech 1.0. And then the second part of that model was looking in areas that had been ignored by the venture capital community, not just in clean tech, but more broadly. And so, and recognizing that there were these really exciting technologies that were coming out of areas where, there was a strong strategic community and great relationships already in place, and where, valuations were lower, deals were less competitive, and the cost of doing business was a lot lower. And especially for, a hard tech company, that was really important. And so we focused in the Rocky Mountain region in Fund One, and with our second fund, have kind of expanded to look at the Western and Central regions in the US and Canada more broadly, but still focusing on those underserved regions just because we found such exciting deals there. And, again, recognize that often these deals, thinking about like ag deals, for example, in Idaho, I mean, there's such a strong strategic and community there, and there's so much support from industry in that region. It makes so much sense to have an ag company in Idaho. You wouldn't want an ag company, to be in Boston necessarily.
When did you guys close Fund 2?
We have not closed Fund 2, so we are fundraising right now. We decided to start fundraising a little bit later, I think, than most funds. We really, because we'd been very intentional about building kind of a new model for investing in clean tech, we really wanted to have a track record. We wanted to have exits. And so we started to fundraise once we had 2 exit events that were kind of in the works. And so we have one acquisition that will be wrapped up in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And then we have a partial exit out of another one of our companies, and that should be done within the next month. So once we had kind of some visibility into when those 2 liquidity events would be happening, we decided that was a good time, that we had enough of a track record. We had some good data behind our model, and we could go out and start fundraising. So it's a little bit later than I think most funds would traditionally wait before raising a second fund. But again, we decided if we haven't figured out a good model, we shouldn't be doing this. So let's wait till we have the results in.
Are your LPs generally Utah-centric?
No, not necessarily. We do have a couple Utah LPs and LPs from this region, but again, partly because of just the timing of Fund One, there was a lot more interest in Europe than in the US. I think for a number of reasons. One, clean tech was still kind of a new space for a lot of folks, and then those people who were familiar with it hated it, and so it wasn't a very receptive environment here for fundraising. So our anchor investor is actually a Swiss family. What's been nice, though, is now looking at, in raising Fund 2 and looking at the landscape and how it's evolved, especially with the progress that has been made in the impact community. We have found a lot more interest here at home, which has been phenomenal. We would love to work with, investors in our backyard who actually have the chance to see some of the companies and come out and, understand the impact that's being made, not just in, quarterly and annual reports, but in person, because it's literally in their backyard.
I see 4 investments on the website. Is that the total number of investments from Fund 1?
We made 5 investments total. So 4 are still standing, which is a pretty good batting average. The 4 that are still with us have done quite well, and we're really optimistic about the kind of upside for each of them.
Upside. I like what you did there. You've alluded to a couple of times this green tech or clean tech boom that happened in the late 2000s. For listeners who aren't aware, can you give us an overview of that landscape and what was happening and why some investors are so sensitive to it?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, again, this was long before my days in venture capital. So I was still wearing all my nonprofit hats during that time and not paying any attention to what was happening in venture capital and clean tech specifically. But having spent a lot of time kind of researching what happened, obviously hindsight is 2020, but it seems, like some of the issues were really around the fact that people got very excited about the space and jumped in without fully understanding what commercializing clean tech meant and how that was different than commercializing, software companies or some of the, typical successes from venture at that time. So a lot of folks, I think, didn't understand how early some of the technology was. It was really too early. So people were, investing, expecting an exit in 2 to 5 years, when really it was a biofuel company that was going to they were still in kind of the R&D phase, and it was going to be 10 to 15 years before they were, at a point where they could be acquired. Another thing that I think people didn't fully understand were all the capital requirements that, especially some of those more capital intensive companies like batteries and biofuels and solar, things that were really popular at that time. And so, people invested a couple million and then, didn't realize that it was going to take 100 million again to get them to the point where they actually had a commercially viable product. And then lastly, I think, there were a lot of kind of macroeconomic factors at play that didn't help the fact that it was already a difficult and probably inappropriate investment for clean tech, in terms of there was obviously in 2008 the recession, and then you also saw China kind of undercutting a lot of US companies when it came to solar, and that really adversely affecting the, companies that VCs had poured way too much money into in the US and solar. And so it was a number of different, maybe poor investment decisions compounded by macroeconomic factors that, I mean, it was a bloodbath. I think I was reading some statistic that, less than half of funds even returned invested capital. So it was not a pretty picture. And I think people really, they were, I mean, obviously, if you get burned like that, you're not going to jump back into the space lightly. And so I think there are some people who still feel that clean tech is not an appropriate option for venture capital, and that it requires more patient capital or kind of different financing options. But we've found that there really are some great opportunities out there. That again, so we talk about the clean tech lens. The second lens we apply is what we call a venture lens. And if you use that second screen, you can actually find some really exciting, highly investable opportunities in the space.
What are some characteristics or examples of companies that look really good through this clean tech lens and the venture lens?
I'll give an example of a company in our current portfolio. So Solid Carbon Products is one of our Utah companies, and they have developed a way to take CO2 and turn it into high value carbon nanomaterials, carbon black, carbon nanotubes, nanofiber. And what's exciting about that is because obviously if you think about taking CO2 and basically you're permanently sequestering it through this process, so you're eliminating CO2 emissions. You're also offsetting other CO2 emissions, because a lot of for example, carbon black, the process to create carbon black is it's a dirty industry, and the emissions profile is pretty nasty. So, on the environmental side, that's great. There's a clear impact that's being made, it's measurable, and it's really significant. But on the, the venture side of things, looking at, a really exciting market opportunity, and then looking at the economics, the market for carbon black, it's established, it's really substantial. The markets for carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofiber are smaller, but there's a lot of interest in those areas. And one of the prohibitive factors so far has been the fact that the price of carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofiber is so high that it can't be used for a lot of the applications where it would be appropriate. There's something like 150,000 patent applications that have been filed with the USPTO for different innovative ways to use CNTs and CNF, and they just, the the economics just haven't worked out yet. So what was really exciting to us about solid carbon is that they are price competitive with carbon black, and the system that they use, it's just a matter of tweaking process inputs to go from carbon black to carbon nanotubes. So the cost of goods is the same, which means that the margins are really exciting, and they're able to produce these much more valuable carbon morphologies at a price point that no one has been able to do so far. And so, we clearly saw the economic possibilities there, and the advantage on the economic side, and that was paired with, obviously the really substantial environmental impact. So, that's an example for us of one that it kind of meets both requirements really clearly, and the fact too that a lot of carbon technologies have been tied to different regulations that make them economically viable, and something like 45Q, which was in the recent tax overhaul, that's like a cherry on top, but they're not dependent on that. So again, that goes back to our idea of a resilient revenue model. They really can't be dependent on some sort of like tax incentive or regulatory push. It has to be a pull from the markets themselves.
How important is the technology versus the team or who you're investing in?
It's similar to any other sector in venture capital, and there's that kind of like tired but honestly still very appropriate adage that you can have a mediocre technology with a phenomenal team, and that will win every time over a phenomenal technology with a mediocre team. And that's especially true, I think, in clean tech, because it can be a really difficult space to A, get additional investment, and B, commercialize technologies. And so it's really crucial to have a team that kind of understands this space and really understands the industry as well, and the kind of the dynamics of the industry.
Do you ever look at your peers in venture who are investing in technologies that may have a clearer and shorter route to market and feel jealous that you can't invest in companies like that?
I mean, there are definitely times when it's like, oh God, why aren't we just investing in some app that is going to, give us a return in 18 months? But at the same time, I get so excited about the types of technology that we're working with that, those feelings are fleeting and few and far between. I really believe in what we're doing, and that makes the sometimes more challenging landscape completely worthwhile.
How often are the companies that you're talking to and investing in pulling out technology from universities and university programs, licensing it, and then using like non-dilutive funding? For a little bit of background, on Upside, we have had, like 5 or 6 companies, Jay?
That are university spinouts?
That are university spinouts that are doing some sort of hard science that probably could fit this clean tech, but through a venture lens. I'm just curious, when you look at companies, how often are they going through that more academic path, and how often are they maybe going through like more of a commercial route to start?
I think there's a lot of diversity in this space in terms of how companies get their start. So we certainly see companies that are coming out of universities. We have relationships with universities that do a great job of incubating and fostering that type of technology that would be considered clean tech. Increasingly, and something that I get really excited about, is that we have seen this really kind of significant uptick in the number of supportive programs that help to validate and act as either incubators or accelerators for clean tech companies. And so it's interesting. I was looking at some of the data around the types of companies that people were investing in back when as we talked about the clean tech boom and bust. And in, I think it was 2006, there were only a handful of, like 5 max, what this, the research defines as ecosystem hubs. That would be any kind of accelerator or incubator or national lab or university programs specifically designed to help to support early stage clean tech companies. Now there are 49. And some of that, and it's not just kind of, we're clean tech broadly defined accelerator. There are accelerators that focus very specifically on kind of subsectors within clean tech and do a phenomenal job of really validating those technologies. And so the pool of early stage companies is much more advanced than it was when people were first starting to invest in the space, which I think is great. And that's going to save investors a lot of heartache, because now we're getting a higher quality pipeline of deals, which has been awesome. So I know that's not really answering your question about non-dilutive and kind of university spinouts, but it's kind of that within the broader context of what's happening is something that we're really excited about.
What do you wish was better in the clean tech and renewable tech space today?
Oh, that is a good question. I do wish there was a more supportive LP base. I mean, I think we're getting there, and we're starting to see more and more folks who are open to clean tech. But we go to the fundraising events where there are all these family offices or institutional LPs. When we kind of get matched, there are really only a slice of them that are truly interested in clean tech or open to it. Other people will meet with and they'll say like, oh, that's really interesting. Clearly, it's important, but that's not a sector that we're really open to or we're interested in. And I think there's still a lot of kind of backlash from Clean Tech 1.0, and then there's still a lot of misinformation that's flying around about clean tech and what it really is and what the opportunities look like. I think people still think that it's really expensive and it takes a really, really long time, and that's not always the case. Cyclotron Road did an interesting study recently, and I don't want to butcher their numbers, and I'm trying to remember them off the top of my head, but basically they found that the average time to exit for hard tech companies in this space is closer to 5 years, I think. So it's actually a lot quicker than I think a lot of people have assumed for a long time. People have assumptions that it's going to be 10, 12, 15 years, but looking at the data, it is more appropriate for and fits well within kind of a venture model. So I do wish that there was a little bit more of an understanding on the LP side about the opportunities that exist and what this landscape really does look like, not just in terms of the impact, but also when it comes to the potential for really exciting returns.
I want to take a little bit of a right turn here and talk about the work that you do with Womenpreneurs. You started this interview saying, I'm your least likely venture capitalist, and you found yourself there. And now you probably look around at your peers and you see a lot of guys that look like Eric and I more than women like you. So talk to us about the work you do with Womenpreneurs, how it started, why it started.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that one of the reasons I always tell what is, actually embarrassing story, I probably shouldn't say in public that I had a Google venture capital at my first day at work. That's probably something I should never be telling people. But one of the reasons I like to talk about it is I want to be an example of the fact that you don't have to have a certain pedigree and background to get into the space. As as a man, woman, I think that there's an idea about who a venture capitalist is and and who that opportunity is given to, and that's what's created to some degree what is a really homogenous group of venture capitalists. And I think we need more diversity in this space in terms of gender and ethnicity and socioeconomic background, geography. And so the more that people understand that there are avenues to accessing this space that are not through some of a few specific academic institutions or investment banking or some of the more traditional routes. So that's one of the reasons that I do always talk about that. And specifically when it comes to women, I would love to see more women who are on the investor side of the table, and that's something that we're actually working on at Womenpreneurs. But the reason, and we started it very accidentally, coming from the nonprofit space to venture capital. One of the first things that I noticed is that I was no longer in rooms full of women. In fact, I was often the only woman in the room. The other thing that started to happen around the time that I made the jump is that suddenly it seems like every time there was a woman who was starting a company, she'd end up in my office, having been referred there by some really well-intentioned guy who was like, I don't understand this. You're a woman. You should go talk to the other woman who is on the investor side. And this would happen like from day one when I had no idea what I was doing, let alone what advice to give to a woman, especially in a completely different industry. I mean, I had women who were starting quilting companies and travel companies who would end up, like I said, kind of sitting across from me in my office. But it was wonderful. And it was an interesting and really eye-opening way to understand some of the other ways in which women are under-resourced, that it's not just about access to capital, it's about mentorship, it's about networks and feeling like they have a community of support around them. And so it was about that time that my co-founder and I, she was working for a local accelerator, we decided to have an event where we would just take some of the women who'd been coming to us who were starting companies and wanted access to resources and support and put them in the same room with some of the women we knew who have already gone down this path of entrepreneurship, successfully or otherwise, but at least had lived that experience and could maybe provide some mentorship and support. And so we kind of had developed this, what we called like group mentorship model, where we just had women show up, we put them in small groups with some of these mentor figures. And we thought that maybe, like 20 or 30 people were going to show up. And 100 women came, which totally blew us away. And so then we thought, okay, well, maybe we'll have like one more event. And that's why, that the name Womenpreneurs is not like this really thought out name of what we wanted this, entity to be. It was because that was the name of our first event. And then we just had another event that was, Womenpreneurs 2. And then, that one, again, another 100 women showed up. And after just having these one-off events for about a year and a half, like, okay, there's clearly something here. what do we want to do with this, and what can we do, to really move the needle for women in Utah. And so we have kind of gotten ourselves organized a bit, actually identified what it is that we think will create really positive change. And essentially our theory of change is that to build strong women-led businesses, we need more women who are decision makers at potential strategic partners and customers, and also women who are decision makers at investment firms or who are actually deploying capital. And so we now have programming that we've developed for women in kind of all in those three categories. So women who are starting businesses, women who want to access leadership opportunities in existing companies and corporations, and then women who could be investors. And so it's been really exciting to see how our community has coalesced around us and this vision and fully bought into it. So we have a community now of about 900 women in Utah who are active online and come to our events, participate in our workshops, which has been really, really phenomenal. So we're still figuring out how we structure all of this programming, how it all makes sense and fits together. But I think we've made a lot of phenomenal progress, and it's been awesome to see the community's response to what it is that we've decided to become.
I'm curious on this investor side. A lot of the ways that people come on and get into VC is maybe they exit a company and then they become an angel investor. And maybe this is just a perpetual cycle, so this could be a misinformed question. But do you see like an appetite from the women who are in your network to like want to get into angel investing as kind of an intro into potentially getting into VC or getting into startups or anything like that?
We are starting to see that, and frankly, we've had to build that appetite to some degree. There's a concept that we came up with that we call the ascendant economy, and it's this idea that again, in order to not just have really well supported female-led companies, but also to have companies that are built with the kind of inclusive culture and values and business models baked in from the beginning, and not kind of reverse engineered into these behemoth companies that are now, after like fighting the tides of change for generations, are like, oh, we're going to have inclusion policies. So if we want to kind of bake that in from the beginning, we do need to have a more diverse set of people sitting on the other side of the table as investors and as people who support the really early stages of business development. And so once we kind of identified this concept of the ascendant economy, which is essentially this idea that we create kind of this new economic structure that will exist alongside how people have been traditionally going about funding companies and who's traditionally been deploying capital and helping to advise and build those companies. The data shows that these companies will be really successful, and that eventually the kind of existing economy will begin to resemble what we call the ascendant economy more and more. And so, but to do that, we really have to be intentional about building out that base of investors. And the truth is that, especially in Utah, there's not this like community of women who are chomping at the bit to become investors because they've never thought about being investors before, and no one's ever told them that they could, and shown them kind of the rationale for why. And so that's part of our process, is educating women about you can actually have a really meaningful impact on these women-led businesses, because people are, women especially, are really strong and passionate champions of women-led businesses. And that's what was interesting about our events too, is about 40% of our attendees were not women who were building businesses. They were women who wanted to support women-led businesses. And so we've been leveraging that passion and helping people understand that there are a number of ways you can support women-led businesses, one of which, and again, this is kind of our theory, is that it will become kind of this virtuous cycle of women investing in women. So if women are successful in, and make it, to like the C-suite in a large corporation, they're going to have the capacity to invest in women. So we need to start kind of inculcating this idea now of becoming a financial champion of women, not just a kind of like on the sidelines cheerleader advocate. So a lot of it has been around education, just that this is an option and here's how you do it, if should you so decide. But what we've seen is that women are also really interested in impact investing as investors. And so there's some, and often, the companies that a lot of women are starting have an impact component. So it's a really nice entree into the world of angel investing, or even venture capital, starting with the impact side of things. Because a lot of women are really phenomenal philanthropists, and they're really, really good and really savvy at making donations. And so it's just a little bit of a tweak then to take that next step to impact investing. And so that's kind of how we feel is one of the best ways to kind of bring women into the investment space.
Just putting on impact investing presentations at misaligned keynotes and hoping that someone's there that really likes it, huh?
Exactly. Clearly, that is a formula for success.
So this is a little bit of a selfish question because Jay and I are not women. We are your prototypical like late 20s white co-hosts of a podcast. Like we're everything people make memes about. How do we do better in terms of women in VC?
Oh, that's such a great question, and I'm really glad you asked that. So there are a number of ways that men can be champions of women-led companies as well. And in fact, if you think about right now who has kind of the biggest pulpit from which to affect change, it is men just like you, white men. And so the more we can get men to be talking about this, to call out the inequalities and inequities when you see them, I think the more quickly we'll make change. So, and we certainly don't want this to be like oh, it's just us over here in our corner fighting against you. I think it's really, and especially if you look at the data around companies that are diverse and have true equality, actually, they're better companies. The returns are better. Their stock prices are higher. And so it's to everyone's benefit to be clamoring for this type of equality. So as far as how you can do that, a couple of tips that I often talk about at our events, one of which is amplification. If there's a woman who's doing something really interesting and really cool, making sure that you're amplifying her company, her mission, and that goes, for both like social media, but also in a meeting, there's still all this data around the fact that women get talked over more. They don't, people tend to kind of ignore what they say, and then someone else will say it a few minutes later and kind of claim it as their own idea. And so the concept of amplification actually came out of the Obama administration. A group of women kind of got together and had some men who were kind of allies of theirs say, like, listen, the next time I get talked over in a meeting, will you call it out? And so the men started saying, like, actually, Bob, Susan said that 2 minutes ago. Why don't we give the time back to her so she can more fully explain what she was talking about? And so I think amplification can be appropriate in that setting, but also in a much broader way too, about just highlighting the interesting things that women-led companies are doing when talking specifically about the startup space. So that's a big one. And then another one is mentorship. And there's been so much backlash lately around, unfortunately, around this idea that like men don't want to be in the same room as women, as a single woman anymore, which is so unfortunate because there's all this data that supports the fact that companies that get access to mentors have a far, far bigger chance at being successful. And so if we're denying women mentorship because, men are afraid of some sort of, fallout or backlash, I just think it is so unfortunate, and we're really moving backwards in so many ways when something like that happens. So I would say, don't shy away from mentorship. I think men know how to behave appropriately, and that will save them from any sort of unpleasant fallout. So just don't be a jerk and you'll be fine. But really, seek out opportunities to mentor women because that can be really meaningful. And unfortunately, we're seeing a decline in mentorship, which is, as I said, a really disappointing product of some of the other Me Too and some of the other events that have happened recently.
It's bizarre to me sometimes how much Eric and I are on the same wavelength in terms of questions. I was trying to ask what Eric asked, and I couldn't think of how to phrase it. So going off of your response there of amplification, what is the line of amplification versus tokenization?
Oh yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with talking to the woman that you want to amplify and saying, like, how can I help to amplify you? I don't want to put you in a position where you, like, putting you on a panel as like the token woman. And I've certainly had that experience. I'm the token woman a lot. I remember when I was applying for grad school, I Googled myself, see what would come up if the reviewers Googled me. And I was listed as a mentor for a local accelerator that I'd never once been a mentor for. And I was the only woman on that page. And it's like they just Googled women in VC in Utah. My name popped up and they stuck me on their mentor page, which was infuriating. And so, that's definitely something that happens a lot. But I look at that example and like, if they had come to me and said, would you like to be a mentor? I mean, that would have been completely different. And so I think a lot of it is just having that conversation. And then also it is pretty obvious if the motivation I think is good, then the action that follows it will often be appropriate, if that makes sense. So, it sounds like you guys have the right motivation there. I think when their motivation is to check a box, it's pretty obvious.
Well, this has been awesome, Rose. We went a little bit over, so thanks for hanging with us. If people want to learn more about you or the work that you do after the show, where should they go?
3 places, which will make it extra confusing. If they're interested in learning more about renewable tech, renewablevc.com. If they're interested in learning more about Womenpreneurs, womenpreneursutah.com. I know Womenpreneurs, it's terrible to spell, but it's like entrepreneur, but with women. And then if you want to learn more about me specifically, find me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect. And send me a message, and look forward to meeting some new interesting folks from this great opportunity.
All right, Jay, we just spoke with Rose from Renewable Tech Ventures. I feel like everyone who gets into VC says that they are like the least likely VC candidate.
It's true. And everyone trying to get into VC is saying, why can't I get into VC?
Just knocking at the door as hard as possible, saying, look at me.
Yeah. Similar background to Monique Villa, though, and how she got here. Starting with nonprofits, kind of finding her way into venture capital because she came across someone who was doing impact investing. Also interesting to hear the story of, I went to a panel, don't know how I got to the panel, don't know why I went to a certain panel, but it had such an impact on me, pun intended, that I wanted to get into impact investing. And there was one fund here in Salt Lake City that was doing that. She sat down with the founder, Todd Stevens, convinced him to bring her on, which is a huge feat in its own right. Whether or not you think you're the least likely person to get into VC, meeting with the founding partner of a new fund, and convincing them that you're the right person to bring on as an early, one of few employees, and then working your way up to partner, seems like Rose is doing pretty well for herself.
Yeah, seems like Renewable Tech Ventures is doing pretty well for itself as well, kind of making a name for itself in Salt Lake City, in a state that is historically not the most clean or green friendly, but finding companies nonetheless in Utah to invest in.
Lesson I'm starting to learn, if you're trying to get into VC, dear listener, lean into your willingness and hopefully ability to fundraise. Sounds like that is a skill that people running early stage funds are looking for, someone that is interested and able to go out and ask people for money. Rose says that's something that she's never been or never had a problem doing. And I think that played a lot to her advantage in getting this role.
What do you think about this model of impact investing with two lenses? You have the venture lens and the impact lens.
Impact investing seems very, very difficult for the reason of there's nobody in the world who would say, I don't also want to do good while I'm making a lot of money. And so if not everybody is doing, quote, impact investments with their investments, it makes me think that it's hard to find a good number of genuinely high return companies that are also doing really, really well for, the public good. Not to say they're not out there. It just is clear that they're fewer and farther between, which makes investing in that pool inherently more difficult because there's fewer of them to find and to invest in.
I wonder how you manage deal flow then. Like, do you just know all of your potential deal flow if it's so small around the country?
I doubt it, because here's the other thing that I think is probably true and difficult. There are probably a lot of teams and founders who are doing great work who may be investable companies that are not coming from that world and don't even know how to get seen or found.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is probably on the company side. Are they branding themselves as impact investments? And why would you do that when there's less capital being deployed into impact funds than there is in a general venture capital fund?
And if Todd Stevens, when he was starting this, if Rose said, you're impact investing, and he didn't know what impact investing was, and he was doing investing, what are the chances that a team who got into something because they wanted to do good is familiar with investing and then familiar with the term impact investing? It just seems like a difficult and inefficient, you can think of it as a marketplace of companies wanting to be funded and funders trying to fund companies in the space. It seems like an inefficient marketplace that probably is still pretty nascent in getting people on both sides and working together.
Seems like someone could create the circle up of impact startups and own all the data in this space.
Maybe that could be you, dear listener. If you have thoughts on this episode, you can tweet at us at UpsideFM. Or if you have any longer form thoughts, you can email us, hello@upside.fm. We'd love to talk to more companies in this space, companies that have been invested in by impact investors, to flesh out this thesis a little bit more. What do you think, Eric?
I'd love that. We have Bob from up in Vermont, and now we have Rose from out in Salt Lake. We haven't really talked to any companies with the intent of talking about them as impact investments.
And we're still just scratching the surface of moving west across our great nation here. So if you know any companies, west of the Mississippi, west of Texas?
We'll go west of the Mississippi.
West of the Mississippi, who are impact companies. We'd love to talk with them. You can email us at hello@upside.fm, or again, tweet at us at UpsideFM. We'll talk to you next week. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter @UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep on rhyming, find a way and get it.